By the time I found my seat at my own son's rehearsal dinner, the hostess had already apologized to 3 other people for the confusion, and not once to me. My name card had been placed at the far end of a narrow table beside the service station, close enough to the swinging kitchen door that every few minutes it brushed warm air and the smell of garlic across my shoulder. I stood there for a moment, holding my clutch in both hands, waiting for someone to notice. My son, Ethan, was across the room laughing with his future father-in-law. My future daughter-in-law, Vanessa, glanced at me, then at the chair, and gave me a smile so thin it barely counted. "Oh, good," she said, smoothing the front of her dress. "You found it." We had to be strategic with the premium seats. Premium seats, as if I were lucky to be indoors. When I quietly asked the wedding planner if there had been a mistake, she lowered her voice and said, "The couple wanted immediate contributors closer to the front." I'm sure you understand. Immediate contributors. I understood perfectly. I sat down while waiters squeezed past, me carrying trays of champagne for people who had apparently earned visibility. No one introduced me to the family seated beside me. No one asked if I was comfortable. At one point, Vanessa's mother leaned over and said, almost kindly, "These events can be overwhelming when you're not used to this level of formality." I smile because there are humiliations too petty to dignify in public. What none of them knew, not the planner, not Vanessa, not even my son, was that 3 months earlier, after 41 years of marriage, my late husband had left me $53 million. And I had told absolutely no one. My husband, Daniel, died on a rainy Tuesday in March, the kind of gray day that makes the world look half-finished. He had been sick for a year, but even when illness entered a house, he had a way of carrying himself like a man still building something. That was who he had always been. We married young, before there was anything polished about our lives, before tailored suits and boardrooms and investment statements. In the beginning, there was a rented duplex with a broken dryer, 1 used car, and a coffee tin where we tucked away whatever we could spare at the end of each month. Daniel built his first business out of that kind of life. Not glamour, not luck, just years of long hours, risk, discipline, and an appetite for sacrifice that most people admire only after it starts paying off. I kept books at the kitchen table, packed invoices, skipped vacations, hosted clients when we couldn't afford restaurants, and learned how to stretch one paycheck through 2 ambitions. Later came real success, then investments, then properties, then quiet wealth layered over decades. But none of it ever felt like easy money because I knew what it had cost us in sleep, time, and youth. By the time Daniel died, he had structured everything carefully. There were trusts, holdings, accounts, and a final letter written in his own slanted hand. He left me $53 million. Yes, but what he really left me was a record of our life together. Every line in those documents carried a piece of some choice we had made side by side. That is why I told no one. I did not want condolences turning into calculations. I did not want sympathy sharpened by curiosity. Most of all, I did not want my grief crowded by people suddenly remembering my name with unusual warmth. I wanted silence, order, and the right to bury my husband before the world began pricing what his absence was worth. At first, Ethan was gentle after the funeral. He called often, asked if I was sleeping, came by with soup I never ate. But once the engagement to Vanessa moved from announcement to production, something in him began to shift. He sounded hurried, distracted, almost managerial. Our conversation shortened. If I raised a concern, he smoothed over it too quickly. If Vanessa was unkind, he reframed it as stress. I told myself it was wedding pressure. I told myself grief made everything feel sharper than it was. But grief does not invent distance. It only strips away your ability to pretend you don't feel it. The rehearsal dinner seat was not the first slight. It was simply the one that finally made the pattern impossible to excuse. In the early weeks after the engagement, I assumed I would be included in small ways. Not centered, not indulged, just included. I imagined dress fittings where someone might ask my opinion, planning lunches where I might be invited to listen, perhaps a conversation about family traditions Daniel would have wanted carried forward. Instead, details reached me the way weather does, already formed and impossible to influence. I learned the venue from a forwarded invoice Ethan accidentally sent to the wrong email. I found out the ceremony time from my sister-in-law. I discovered that the memorial candle for Daniel had been cut from the program only because Vanessa mentioned, offhandedly, that weddings should feel light, not funereal. When I gently said his absence might matter on his only son's wedding day, Ethan pressed his lips together and told me, "Mom, please don't make this about you. About me." As though 41 years of marriage and 6 months of widowhood had turned into some selfish performance I was staging for attention. Then came the dress issue. Vanessa sent me a list of approved tones for mothers and mother figures, and every option was some version of muted taupe, smoky beige, or faded silver, colors that looked less celebratory than upholstered. When I asked whether a soft blue might work instead, since Daniel had always loved that color on me, she replied, "We're trying to avoid anything that photographs too prominently." Too prominently. I was apparently a visual risk. The week after that, Vanessa's mother, Celeste, invited me to lunch with the bridal party mothers. She spent most of the meal discussing floral installations, custom stationery, and the imported champagne they had selected because presentation sets the tone. At one point, she asked, with polished innocence, whether I planned to contribute to the live string quartet, since Ethan mentioned you were keeping things simple these days. I looked at my son across the table, waiting for him to correct the implication that I could not afford elegance or that generosity had somehow become my moral test. He only reached for his water and said nothing. That silence hurt more than Celeste's little smile ever could. Once people decide what they think you are, they begin speaking around you as if the verdict is settled. I heard it everywhere. Vanessa's cousin joking that not everyone came from donor class. A bridesmaid asking whether my jewelry was sentimental because vintage pieces have such charm. Celeste remarking that some families offer support in money and others in presents, and that both should be appreciated. Presents, as if my role was to arrive, smile, and avoid costing anyone anything. And then, somehow, while being treated like a guest of limited importance, I was still expected to be useful. 3 days before the wedding, Ethan called to ask if I could assemble 48 welcome bags because Vanessa was overwhelmed and the hotel staff had made mistakes. He asked if I could do it that same evening and, if possible, also cover the cost of refilling the missing gift box items because it's not a huge amount. I said yes to the bags. I said nothing about the insult. I spent 4 hours alone in a hotel conference room, tying ribbons around bottled water and snack boxes for guests who would never know the groom's mother had been seated by the kitchen door. By midnight, my back ached, my fingers were raw from cardstock edges, and I understood with painful clarity exactly who they thought I was. Useful when needed. Invisible when not. I might have kept explaining everything away if I had not taken the wrong hallway on the morning of the wedding. I was carrying a garment bag and a box of the welcome bags no one had thanked me for when I heard Vanessa's voice through the half-open door of a bridal suite. I was not trying to listen. I would have walked past if my own son's name had not stopped me. He said she's being weird about money, Vanessa said. Then Celeste answered, lower and sharper. Because she knows what's expected. Even if Daniel didn't leave as much as people assumed, a widow in that house is not hurting. I stood perfectly still. Vanessa laughed, but there was irritation under it. That's what I said. We're not asking for a fortune. Just help. The down payment, maybe the honeymoon upgrade, maybe seed money for Ethan if he wants out of that firm a year. It's not like she has anyone else to spend it on. My fingers tightened around the handle of the box until the cardboard bent. Celeste made a small sound of agreement. Honestly, if she had any intention of being generous, she would have offered by now. Some women hold on to money because it's the only way they feel important. Then Vanessa said the sentence that changed everything for me. She probably thinks because Dad died, she gets to be treated delicately forever. But if she's not contributing, Ethan needs to stop letting her act like she's some central figure. A central figure in my own son's wedding. In a life I had helped build. In the family Daniel and I made from scratch. There was no grief in their voices. No affection. No concern that I was lonely or healing or trying to stay upright inside the first year without my husband. Just arithmetic. What I might have. What I should give. What role I had earned if I did not pay. And in that instant, I understood something I had been resisting for weeks. Their kindness had conditions attached to it. The little smiles, the careful invitations, even Ethan's soft concern after Daniel died. They had all been resting on an assumption that sooner or later, I would open a checkbook. They had already furnished a future with money that was not theirs. They had already spent my silence in their heads. I backed away before they saw me and walked to the empty stairwell at the end of the hall. I set the box down on the landing and stood there in my pale blue dress with my heart pounding harder than it had at Daniel's funeral. I was no longer confused. I was clear. Once I stopped mistaking entitlement for stress, the entire wedding weekend became painfully easy to read. The pressure sharpened first through suggestion. Vanessa, while pretending to be flustered, mentioned that the upgraded honeymoon suite had fallen through unless someone close stepped in quickly. Celeste observed at breakfast that generous families often surprised newlyweds with a financial cushion, especially in uncertain markets. Even the wedding planner, who had mastered the art of sounding neutral while carrying other people's contempt, asked whether I intended to settle the additional floral balance before the reception, since the couple had hoped all parental contributions would be resolved by today. Parental contributions, a phrase broad enough to sound proper and pointed enough to make refusal look cruel. I answered every version of the question the same way. Calmly, vaguely, without apology. I'm sure you'll work it out. At first they seemed stunned by that, then irritated, then openly cold. Vanessa stopped trying to hide it. Her smile disappeared whenever we were alone. When photographs were being organized before the ceremony, she moved me out of one grouping and into another without explanation, placing me on the edge as if I were a distant aunt instead of the groom's mother. Celeste began speaking to me in that crisp, polished tone people use when they have decided warmth is wasted on you. And Ethan, my son, the child I had once rocked through fevers and college rejection letters and his father's diagnosis, kept choosing convenience over courage. That was the worst part. Not that he agreed with them entirely. I still don't know if he did. It was that he let it happen because stopping it would have cost him ease. An hour before the ceremony, he found me alone near the chapel vestibule and closed the door behind him. For one suspended second, I thought perhaps he had finally come to say something real. Instead, he rubbed the back of his neck and asked if I could transfer $25,000 by Monday. Just temporarily, he said, to help us reset after the wedding. Vanessa's parents have covered a lot, and I don't want this starting off uneven. Uneven. I looked at his face and searched for Daniel in it, for the steadiness, the decency, the instinct to protect rather than extract. What I found instead was discomfort, embarrassment, and the quiet expectation that I would make this simple for him. I'm not discussing money today, I said. He exhaled hard through his nose. Mom, why are you being like this? Like this. Not grieving. Not wounded. Not publicly humiliated. Just difficult. He left before I answered, and I stood there with one gloved hand against the polished wood of the pew, understanding that love can survive disappointment, but respect rarely survives repeated surrender. By then, I knew exactly what decision I was making. They just didn't know it yet. The moment came during the reception just after dinner, when the room was warm with wine and self-congratulation, and everyone was pretending the day had unfolded exactly as planned. Vanessa's father stood first to give his toast. He thanked the guests, praised the venue, complimented the bride, and then turned toward Ethan with a smile, so polished it almost passed. For kindness. He spoke about support, about how marriage thrives when a couple is surrounded by people willing to invest in their future. Then, with one hand wrapped around his glass, he added, and of course, we're especially grateful for those who understand that love is not just sentimental. It shows up in meaningful, practical ways. There was soft laughter around the room. A few people glanced toward me. Vanessa lifted her chin. Ethan stared at his plate. That was enough. When the applause faded, I stood slowly and picked up my champagne glass. I did not tremble. Grief had already taken the worst thing from me. This was only truth. I'd like to say a few words, I said. The room quieted, though not out of respect at first. More out of curiosity. I could feel it, the expectation that I might say something emotional, maybe inappropriate, maybe soft and grateful. Something small enough to fit the role they had assigned me. Instead, I smiled. I've spent this entire weekend learning how people behave when they think a widow has nothing left to offer but her presence. No one moved. I was seated where I would be least visible. I was spoken to as though dignity were a luxury someone else had paid for. I was asked to contribute labor, silence, and eventually money, all while being reminded, in ways both subtle and obvious, that my place here depended on what I could provide. Vanessa's face changed first, then Celeste's. I set my glass down. What none of you knew is that 3 months ago, when my husband Daniel died, he left me $53 million. You could feel the room inhale. Ethan looked up so fast his chair scraped the floor. Vanessa's mouth parted, but no sound came out. Across the table, Celeste went completely still, her expression flickering through disbelief and calculation so quickly it was almost indecent. I kept going. I stayed silent because grief is not a public marketplace, and I had no intention of turning my husband's death into an audition for everyone else's generosity. But silence has a way of revealing character, and this weekend has revealed more than enough. I reached into my clutch and unfolded a single page. Before coming here, I placed the majority of that inheritance into an irrevocable structure that secures my future, funds the charitable foundation Daniel and I planned for years, and protects every dollar from opportunism disguised as family expectation. The bride side of the room had gone paper white. As for Ethan, I said, and finally looked directly at my son, the trust one once intended to create for you has been delayed indefinitely. Not out of anger, out of clarity. Until you learn the difference between love and access, money would only deepen what is already broken. No one clapped. No one dared. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the sound of an entire room recalculating me in real time. And for the first time all weekend, no one treated me like a burden. Ethan came to see me 4 days later, without Vanessa. He looked exhausted, older somehow, as if one honest moment had aged him more than the wedding ever could. He apologized, but like many late apologies, it arrived carrying more confusion than understanding. He said he had been under pressure. He said things got out of hand. He said he never meant for me to feel small. I told him that intention matters, but not more than pattern. A person can fail you by accident once. Repeatedly is a choice. Vanessa never came. She sent flowers, then a letter, both of which felt less like remorse than damage control. Extended family members who had barely looked at me during the reception suddenly found reasons to call. Their voices softened. Their manners improved. Their interests sharpened. I let most of it pass unanswered. Money does not buy a place in my life. It only reveals who thought they deserved one. In the months that followed, I did exactly what Daniel and I once planned in whispers over late coffee and spreadsheets. I funded the foundation we had talked about for years, supporting trade scholarships, hospice care, and small business grants for widows starting over. I secured my future quietly. I gave where love, effort, and dignity already existed. As for Ethan, I did not cut him off forever. I gave him something harder than money. Time, distance, the chance to decide whether he wanted a mother or an account. My husband's legacy was never just wealth. It was character built slowly, privately, when no one was applauding.